Friends. So I wanted to record a copy of a talk that I gave at an alchemy conference a couple weeks ago on alchemical insights into the book of Job. Um, a lot of people had sent me messages that were curious about um, this particular psychological alchemical reading of the book of Job. And so I figured I would re-record it. It wasn't recorded at the conference, but record it for everyone, and you can have access to it here. This isn't the full essay that I had written on the topic. So perhaps maybe I can link that below. I can link the copy that goes with this talk as well. But if you have any questions or comments about the content or the particular style of reading, feel free to comment and I can get back to you on that and we can wrestle with this. By no means am I making this dogmatic assumptions about this particular way of reading. It's just a different style of reading. And so I hope you enjoy. I am going to share my screen here and get going. The Book of Job has long captivated scholars and theologians with its exploration of human suffering, divine justice, and the relationship between human and the divine. This presentation proposes a perspective on the Book of Job through the lens of alchemical symbolism, shedding a light on its alchemical themes and its spiritual significance. It is important to note that my intention here is to not make metaphysical claims, rather to approach the story of Job as a psychological narrative, allowing room for its profound wisdom to unfold. By considering the figures of Yahweh and Satan as complementary, chaotic impulses emerging out of the ontological ground of the unconscious, urging an ego towards greater psychological awareness, a transformative alchemical metaphor emerges from the Book of Job. This presentation seeks to move through the constraints of literalism that have dominated the theological readings of this story over the centuries. My hope is to offer a new interpretation of suffering and its transformative potential. By examining the narrative through the lens of alchemy, we can gain insight and deeper understanding into the transformation and inner processes Job undergoes that is symbolic of C.G. Jung's journey of individuation. Individuation involves an increasing awareness of one's unique psychological reality, in which a vital relationship between the ego and the unconscious is necessary. My hope is to amplify the symbols at the core of the narrative that point towards a potent psychological alchemical process that often entails a shedding of perspectives that would stifle the soul's inherent richness and inherent duplicity of the God image. The figures within the story, including Job, Yahweh, Satan, Job's friends, and Elihu, can all be reimagined as symbolic figures participating in an inner alchemical process. They symbolize the factors inherent in one's psychological growth, mirroring the spontaneous and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Job's story unfolds as a powerful narrative of an ego's alchemical journey, where suffering serves as a catalyst for inner transformation, especially in regards to how Job's expired one-sided God image of Yahweh is perceived. I believe in the story, Yahweh and Satan together make up what Jung called an image of the self. It is Job's suffering the duplicity of this split God image that ultimately brings Job the attainment of profound wisdom, offering a relativization of conscious with the unconscious and a more complete image of the paradoxical reality of the unconscious. Suffering, when interpreted this way, is viewed as an integral part of one's journey towards individuation, rather than simply being a punitive response by God to one's sin. Suffering is understood as an alchemical crucible where the ego confronts the chaos and the unpredictability in the depths of the unconscious. In this story, I feel this mirrors the stages towards the alchemical opus. At the beginning of the story, Satan comes to Yahweh and makes a bet with him. Satan essentially challenges the integrity of Job's faith. Satan asserts to Yahweh that without all of his excessive material possessions, Job would stray from his faithful position towards Yahweh, i.e., Job is not as spiritual as he claims to be. Psychologically, Satan can be seen here as a symbol of the dark side of the self, or even perhaps the shadow side of the Old Testament God image. The shadow figure brings a disruption in Job's habitual way of being. Although Satan catalyzes the cascade of suffering to come, reading the text psychologically, it seems as if Satan can see through Job's unconscious attachments to his literal material possessions. Satan is basically asserting that Job is channeling his spirituality through his materialism. And if all that were to be stripped, would Job's spiritual position towards Yahweh change? By first destroying all of Job's animals and servants, Satan constellates the beginnings of an alchemical process. Stan Marlin writes, quote, "For the archetypal psychologist James Hillman, death can symbolize death of a materialist viewpoint, freeing us for imaginal and poetic life, a life beyond life, and a movement into psychological and spiritual depths," end quote. The suffering and loss Job endures at this part of the story serves as the beginnings of a psychological initiation, akin to the alchemical nigredo phase. This stage can often involve dark, repetitive, and severe processes. Job's descent into this phase of the process, with the slow and arduous nature of the nigredo, signifies a deep need for inner work and transformation. But what does the death of his animals and his servants symbolize? Satan metaphorically initiates a destruction of Job's old instinctual way of being. The ego is thrown back upon itself. And psychologically, we might call this a form of ego death. Satan then afflicts Job with painful sores, signifying an inflammation, a calcinatio, where impurities are burnt away to purify the ego. This implies the heat on Job's metaphorical alchemical process has intensified. Enger writes, quote, "By the element of fire, all that is unpurified is destroyed and taken away," end quote. These sores symbolize a somatization of the internal heat of transformation. Job's improper relationship to the divine is coming to the surface in a very felt sense way. Chapters 3 through 32 of Job continue to amplify the excruciating nigredo phase of Job's alchemical process. In these, Job is profoundly wrestling with what it means to suffer a descent away from his habitual state of consciousness into the underworld of becoming more psychological and in proper relationship to the unconscious. In the story, Job's friends pose a significant challenge to him when they cannot seem to empathize properly with the level of suffering that Job is facing. While they offer him comfort, they also insist that Job must have sinned to be in this dire condition, urging him to repent and to return to favor with Yahweh. This moral imposition reflects their resistance to Job's descent into the unexplainable, unconscious phenomena that suffering can bring. If we look at this psychologically, their stance is a metaphor for any position within ourselves that refuses to embrace the psychological depths and also has an immense fear of descending into it. This could stem from rigid upper world beliefs, one-sided spiritual righteousness, and excessive attachment to materiality. James Hillman's perspective on modern psychology as being overly focused on transcendence and the brighter side of human nature becomes relevant here. Job's friends symbolize the aspects of psyche that are fixated on transcending suffering, resisting the necessary processes of psychological transformation. From an alchemical standpoint, Job's friends represent a false albedo, a premature whitening that seeks to lighten the incomplete blackness of the soul. In alchemy, the transition from black to white signifies deep suffering of the material, but it is also a gradual process that demands patience and intense inner work. Job, however, challenges the attitude of his friends. He communicates the true nature of his experience, expressing with vulnerability the suffering that accompanies his inner destruction and his blackened state. Rather than yielding to the tempting promise of virginal whiteness and transcendence of the suffering, Job remains committed to his slow and painful process of not trying to navigate his dark night of the soul. This emphasizes the importance of acknowledging and embracing the depths of suffering and psychological transformation, rather than seeking premature solutions and transcendent escapes. Job's journey signifies a commitment to the authentic alchemical process and the genuine transition from Negredo to Albedo, acknowledging the profound suffering and inner work that this takes. In the later stages of the story, a man named Elihu emerges. I think he serves as a psychopomp. Psychopomps guide souls through different realms, and in this context, Elihu serves as an enlightener and teacher that aids Job in moving through his outdated attachments and entering into a new perspective that would be inclusive of the imaginal and the psychological. Elihu emphasizes to Job the multiplicity of ways that the psyche communicates, particularly through dreams, which may initially appear foreign and incomprehensible to a rigid, rational ego. Elihu guides Job to recognize the language of the divine is present. It is just speaking to him in a language that is unfamiliar to Job's egoic consciousness. Elihu mirrors that the real issue lies in how Job is perceiving and relating to God. Elihu bridges the gap between Job's rational, materialistic egoic consciousness and the depths of the unconscious, enabling Job to start to explore the irrational side of the imagination with more imaginal sensibility. The alchemical phase of blue, likened to Elihu's role as a psychopomp, marks the transition out of the Negredo phase. This phase begins to introduce moral, intellectual, and divine considerations, allowing for a wider evaluation of psychic reality. The blue represents a shift in perspective from viewing suffering as mere distress to recognizing its intrinsic value. Blue deepens reflection and introduces the capacity to ponder, to consider, and to meditate on the significance of experiences within a deep state of feeling. Elihu, in Hillmanian fashion, encourages Job to see through his suffering and ask the fundamental question, who is Yahweh really? This question challenges Job to move from a rational, egoic position to an imaginal one, fostering the right relationship not only with Yahweh, but also with Satan, and all of the other archetypal forces that might influence the way that he sees his world. This transition through the alchemical blue is described by Jung as a deceptive shimmer that magically transforms perceptions, bringing together seemingly disparate elements into an unsuspected unity. Yahweh's emergence from a storm at the end of the story symbolizes the meeting of opposing forces. Conscious and unconscious come together in an unio mentalis. The god challenges Job's understanding of the unknowable realms of the psyche, leading Job to acknowledge his former naivety and his limitations of faith. This eventually brings a shift from his previous image of God to a true recognition of the mysterious forces of the unconscious. Job undergoes a transformative experience where he not only hears of the divine, but he also sees and experiences it directly, leading to a profound change in his relationship to God, and in Jungian fashion, a relationship to the self. This experience aligns with what William James called a mystical union with the divine, characterized by a feeling of, quote, something there in human consciousness. Alchemically, this transition from black to white often begins as an emotional relief, a lightening after much darkness and despair, as if something else exists within the misery. The whitened mind of reflection is associated with an imaginal or archetypal psychology, where individuals can perceive metaphorically and begin to hear the messages of psyche differently. Job's encounter with this divine other evokes a sense of relief and initiates the alchemical whitening process. In the story's epilogue, Yahweh asked Job to pray for his friends, taking the alchemical transformation further. Prayer is described as an experience at the source of religious life, akin to dreaming and psychic life. It establishes a conscious bridge with the numinous and amplifies the religious function of the psyche. Prayer serves as a ritual act that surrenders ego control, allowing one to engage in a conversation with a greater power. I believe that prayer speaks to a reddening of Job's whitened experience. It gives body to the spiritual experience. Through prayer, Job deepens his reflections and gains psychological apprehension of truth and a relationship with the divine on a ritualized, felt sense level. As James Hillman suggests in Revisioning Psychology, true engagement with the religious function of the psyche requires an acknowledgement of the mystery as well as an acceptance of death, loss, and suffering that is inherent in our transformations. The story of Job emphasizes the interplay of opposites within the God image and the ego's relationship to it. Yahweh and Satan as two halves of a unified God image. And when humans like Job can undergo the suffering that this paradoxical tension of opposites constellates, a richer understanding of the wisdom of the unconscious may be revealed. Yet, for this redemption of wisdom to occur, humans, like Job, must be willing to let go of perspectives and attachments that would obstruct a genuine understanding of the paradox inherent within any experience of suffering. To end with a quote by Lionel Corbett, quote, "There is no answer to the problem of suffering that satisfies everyone, but perhaps struggling with the question is one way of coping with the problem." I hope that you enjoyed that wrestling, that alchemical wrestling process with the God image, which I believe symbolizes what Jung called an ego's journey of individuation, being in right relationship with the capital S self, good and evil, positive and negative, really that is inherent in the depths of archetypal reality. That wholeness brings up these very paradoxical situations that tend to mystify our human ego and leave us in a state of suffering. And I do feel like that suffering, that God image and the wholeness of the God image is part of what it means to become more psychological. So I hope that you enjoyed, and we will talk later.